Hi, my name is Sean Burns, and welcome to Effective Analytics for Startups. These days, everybody wants to be data-driven, but it can be hard to understand what that actually means. What data do you need, and how exactly do you use it to drive decision-making? In this talk, I will attempt to do three things. The first is help you understand what data you need and how do you formulate that data to help you make decisions at your company. The second is a general framework for thinking about making decisions and managing your company and where data might fit into that. And the third is I will attempt to make this as entertaining as possible because this topic is typically extremely boring. So before we get started, who exactly am I? I founded a company called Flurry, which was the largest mobile application analytics and advertising company in the world, up until it was acquired by Yahoo at the end of last year. These days I blog at seanatstartups.co. I also invest, mentor, and advise many startup companies, as you can see from my AngelList profile. Over the course of my career, I've worked with countless companies to help them understand their data and make decisions based on it, and a lot of what you'll hear today is based on all of that experience. So before we jump into the meat of what we'll talk about today, I love to start with this quote: "Every line is the perfect length if you don't measure it." And the reason is that most of the time when people talk about analytics and making data-driven decisions, they use the quote, you can't improve or optimize what you don't measure. And while that is true, it actually misses the point in some ways because it's worse than that. If you don't measure something, not only can you not optimize it, you actually have no idea what it is. And so, for example, let's say that you have a general intuition or you think that your customers are happy, but you don't know, and you don't measure customer happiness. Well, you might just guess, oh, I feel like customers are happy, so then I'll assume customers are happy. And that assumption is very, very dangerous. So measuring things is not just for the purpose of optimizing, it makes sure that you really do understand what's going on in your business. So everything we'll talk about today isn't just for companies that are succeeding or growing and need to optimize around the edges. Even when you're first starting out with your company, it's important to start measuring and thinking about these things so you really understand what's going on, because if you don't, you may wake up one day and realize that you missed something really important. So what can analytics do and what can they not do? Well, I think it's pretty much important for us to agree on this because if we can't agree on this, then the rest of the talk is not going to make much sense. So in my opinion, what can analytics do? It can help you measure performance. And when I say measure performance, I mean objectively understand what have you achieved, what have you not achieved. It can help inform decisions, especially in cases where you have more than one option that you need to choose between, and you can there use analytics to help you choose objectively based on numbers. It can also expose opportunities and challenges, things you might not be aware of that were hidden in your data, patterns that emerged as you were operating your company. Things it cannot do: it cannot fix your problems, it cannot motivate your people, and it cannot run your company, despite what you might read in all of the marketing advertisements for large-scale big data analytics companies. In fact, you as a person need to do those things, but you can use data to do the three things on the left. That being said, let's get to what we'll talk about today. So we will talk about key performance indicators. What in the world is that and what do they mean and how do you pick them? We'll talk about measurement and tracking, meaning how do you actually measure your key performance indicators and how do you track that you actually know what they are and that they're accurate? How do you select what tools to use? There are so many of them. How do we choose between them? And finally, accountability. How do you actually make sure your team is being data-driven and what does it actually mean in practice? And finally, measuring success. And what exactly is success and how in God's green earth do we actually measure it? So let's get started with our key performance indicators, also known as where are we going? So the first question that underlies your entire business for everything you will do is what are your goals? This is not just true for analytics and business intelligence. This is true of everything you do. What are your goals? What do you want to achieve and where do you want to go? Everything derives from your goals. And it's very important to think from your goals on forward because it's often easy to get seduced by the idea of collecting more data or doing more things or doing whatever your other founder friends are working on. But really, your goals are the most important thing, and everything should derive off of them. So for example, you have your vision. That's why you started your company, right? And your vision is whatever you want to achieve with your new company that you just started. And your vision breaks down into goals. Your goals are not the same as your vision. Your goals are the milestones along the way. Your goals are what if you achieve them, you know you're well on your way to achieving your vision. So a goal may not be my 10-year plan. A goal may be what I need to achieve in the next year to let me know I'm on my way toward my 10-year vision of how I will change the world. And from your goals, we derive our KPIs, our key performance indicators. And those are the mileposts that let us know if we have in fact got to our goals, that tell us again that we've gotten to our vision. So key performance indicators then are what tell us how we're doing. They tell us how fast we're moving along our path towards our vision through the navigating maze of goals that we've set up. It's really important to note that these are not key progress indicators. Progress indicators are things that a project manager might use at a big company to figure out how things are going. And the difference is a progress indicator is like that progress status bar you see on your computer screen when you're downloading a file or doing something that takes a while. It's something that measured a finite start and a finite end, and how well you're doing progressing between a very well-known beginning and end. And your startup company is not like that. There is no beginning and end. There is, in fact, not very much well-defined at all. And so you cannot use key progress indicators because they will lie to you, because the end is always moving and the start is probably moving too. So key performance indicators tell us how we're doing by telling us how we're performing. These will be numbers that are very different than progress indicators because they will not necessarily tell us how far we have to go from here, but they will tell us how far we've come, and that is in many cases as best as we can hope for. So let's give an example about how we actually translate a vision into goals, into KPIs, and what does that actually mean? So let's say we wanted to start a new startup company. We had this great idea that Starbucks days were numbered, and what we want to do is allow anyone, anywhere, to get their latte where they're standing by delivering it by drone. So we're going to have these drones delivering lattes everywhere you go. It'll be a super simple service. Maybe we'll call it like Drate or Latte Drone or something. I don't know. I'm not in marketing, so but we want to deliver lattes via drone. So if that's our vision, how do we break that into goals? What goals might we set to know that we are well on our way to our vision? Well, here are 3 example goals. Maybe we reach 100 deliveries per day in our headquarter city of San Francisco. Maybe we reach 20,000 paying customers. Maybe we're ready to launch in 3 more cities. These are, of course, not our vision. Our vision is to have everyone in the world receiving their lattes by drone. But these goals, if we can achieve them, tell us we're on our way. We're moving that right direction. And then once we achieve them, we'll set new goals that will be farther down the path towards our vision. And then what KPIs do we need to measure those goals? Well, 3 KPIs that might work are our total deliveries per day. That'll let us know if we've reached this 100 delivery mark. The total paying customers we have, which will tell us when we've reached 20,000 paying customers. And the number of cities with active customers, which will let us know about launching in more locations. And you can see clearly how our KPIs were derived from our goals, were derived from our vision, and it all maps directly together. We haven't just picked KPIs out of thin air, things like website visitors or mobile application installs, things that really aren't necessarily important for measuring our business. What we've done is we derive things that are very clearly matched to our goals and our vision. And there can be only one, which is what makes it so hard. Actually, that's not true. I lied. There can actually be 5. But you can only have up to 5 KPIs. And why can you only have up to 5 KPIs? Well, if you imagine if you have 1 KPI, it's really easy to measure your performance, right? If that number is going up, assuming up is good, then you know things are going well. If that number goes down, you know things are not going well. It's very easy. So once I have 2, 3, 4, 5, it's getting harder because at any given time, half of them might be up and half of them might be down. And if you imagine if you had a dozen KPIs, honestly, at any given day, half your KPIs will be up and half your KPIs will be down. And does that mean you're doing well or not well? And if you ever aren't quite sure if you're doing well or not well, you've defeated the purpose of doing this. So sticking with 5, I have found to be the largest number of KPIs a company can have and realistically manage themselves forward and know what's going on and really not be in this position of wondering how they're doing. Because if you're not, you may end up with this. And this may look really fancy. This is an actual dashboard, actually, if you're curious where it came up from. It may look great. It may make you look data-driven, but it's almost impossible for you as a leader to derive insights from this because while this is very detail-oriented and it may help you narrow down very detail-oriented problems, at the high level of your business, how do you know how you're doing? Like, how do you know if you're doing well or not well? It's almost impossible to derive. What you would prefer to have is 5 very clear key performance indicators that you can reference at any given time to know are things going well. And how do you pick those 5 KPIs? That sounds really hard. Almost never can you derive a company down to 1 KPI, but even 5 sounds like a small number. How can I get my company summarized in only 5 KPIs? Well, here's an example. Typically, you would choose the 5 things that are the key, at a very high level, the key components of your business. So in this example, customer acquisition, how do I acquire new customers? Customer engagement, how well do I engage with customers I already have? Customer retention, how long do I hold on to, or how well do I hold on to customers I already have? Revenue, meaning how much do I make for my customers, and cost, how much does it cost me to engage with those customers? And let's assume these are our 5 KPIs. Yours may be different based on your business. It's quite likely. But let's go back to our drone latte business. How might these map to our KPIs? Well, for acquisition, we may say the number of first-time customers every day. And that's a good measure of how our acquisition is going. Our engagement may be number of orders per customer per day. So we know if a customer orders more often, they're more engaged. If somebody orders once a month, they're probably not super engaged. Retention tells us the number of users, for example, ordering 30 days later. And that's a good measure because then we look at if somebody started ordering lattes, are they still ordering lattes 30 days later? That's a good measure of how well we're retaining people over a month. Revenue may be average revenue per order. I'll talk in a minute about why that's not total revenue. And cost may be total cost per delivery. How much does it cost to deliver a latte? And if we match that with our average revenue per order, we'll get a sense of how profitable we are per delivery. And so these would be our 5 KPIs. And then as executives, as founders of companies, we can then use these KPIs to tell us how we're doing in any given day. So it sounds simple, right? Well, it turns out there are bad KPIs and good KPIs. And so what is the difference? Why are those KPIs I just told you good KPIs and not bad KPIs? The difference is typically bad KPIs are numbers that you can directly affect, things that you could change just by doing certain things during the course of your day or work you can actually do. Good KPIs are things that you cannot directly affect. And so what would be an example? So visits to your website. That's not a good KPI because you could, if you wanted to, just run some ad campaigns or do some promotions and drive people to your website. It doesn't mean you convert them into customers. It just means you can drive them just by spending money or doing kind of activities. Same thing with total installs. You could pay for mobile install ads and get people to install your app. It doesn't mean they're going to use it. It just means you've gotten those installs. Likewise, total revenue, you can do elaborate accounting tricks to make your revenue look like whatever you want it to look like over time. And those are things that it may sound like I'm implying you'll be malicious, and you won't be. You'll have all the best intentions. But once you're measuring yourself by these numbers, every ounce of energy you have is going to want to go into making them better. And it's very tempting to start cutting corners, and you will, and it's just human nature. So you won't actively go out there and try to commit accounting fraud to change your revenue, but you will take advantage of the fact that you can change revenue based on different accounting rules. You won't go out there with the purpose of only boosting visitors and installs, but you'll feel really good about that ad campaign you ran if it boosts that number, even if it didn't result in any sales. So what would be good KPIs? Well, a good KPI, instead of unique visitors and users, how about total purchases? We can't force people to purchase. We may be able to force them to come to our website by paying for ads. We may be able to force them to do other things. We cannot force them to press the buy button. So total purchases is a metric we can't directly control. That would be a really good way to measure how well we're engaging with customers. How about active users? While we may be able to run an ad campaign and get somebody to install it, we can't force them to come back again. And so if somebody's active, meaning they're coming back over and over again on a given day or a given week or a given month, that'd be a pretty good KPI. And net profit. It's a lot harder to play fancy accounting tricks with net profit, although you still can. But it's getting harder and harder and closer to the actual business that we're running. And so you can see through this that it's important to pick the KPIs that actually match to what you're doing, but also make sure it's what I call a second level metric, something that you cannot actively affect during your day-to-day operations, and something that you can't, if you had to, make go up just because you had high incentives to do so. So hopefully that makes sense on key performance indicators. If it doesn't, well, it's too late because I'm already done with that section. Let's move on to the second section, measurement and tracking, also known as numbers lie. And so how does Sean know that numbers lie? Well, I know numbers lie because some of the most data-driven businesses in the world lose the most money because they trust numbers. And so hedge funds are some of the most data-driven businesses that we have on planet Earth. And as you can see, just from these 3 headlines that I took from the Wall Street Journal, the hedge fund at the top lost $60 million in 3 weeks. Everest Capital lost almost $1 billion when Switzerland let their currency float. And Alipari, which was a foreign currency exchange platform, actually went out of business at the same time. These are companies that were driven on data. They understand everything we're talking about to a T, and they still really, really blew it. And so if that's possible, if they understood how to be data-driven and they lost so bad, why? What happened? And the answer is that just because you want to be data-driven does not mean you can trust your data. It doesn't mean you can trust your numbers. And there's lots of reasons why. I don't have time to go into all of them, but I will cover 2 of them that I find to be very frequent among startup companies: collection bias and interpretation bias. And these both affect the way you think about your data. So let's start with collection bias. So this is a conversion funnel. If you're not familiar with conversion funnels, they are a way of thinking about your data and how well you convert users between not knowing who you are and a final sale. So in this case, visits to our website, how well does that convert into leads? Maybe somebody gives us their email address and becomes a lead. And then we talk to them on the phone and we qualify them to become a prospect. And finally, we close the sale and they buy our product. And so those are the 4 steps in our conversion funnel, and that's our and the reason it's a funnel is that you'll always have more people at the top, more visits than you have leads. You'll always have more leads than you have prospects, and you'll have more prospects than you have sales, unless you're really amazing at the sales process, but nobody does. It's always that kind of funnel because you lose people along the way. And so let's say we're using some fancy analytics to measure all these things, and it shows us that we have 10,000 visits, that turns into 5,000 leads, which turns into 500 prospects, which turns into 50 sales. That sounds pretty fantastic. I mean, now we have 50% of our visits turning into leads, 5% of our prospects visits turning into prospects, and 0.5% of our visits turning into sales. That's great ratios. If you work in the online industry at all, you'll notice that those are amazing, and we're killing it, and that's fantastic. And what we're going to start doing is making decisions based on how great we are with these numbers. The only problem is we actually did not, in fact, integrate our tracking solution correctly. And in fact, we only added it to 1 out of every 10 of our pages on our website. So in fact, had we done it correctly, we would know that our number of visits was actually 100,000, which meant that we only converted 5% into leads and 0.5% into prospects and 0.05% into sales. And that's a very different picture. And now, if we had made decisions based on our previous data, we would have missed the big problem, which is that our visits to leads is not nearly where we want it to be. It's in fact an order of magnitude lower than we think it is. And this collection bias is when we're collecting data, but it's not telling us the truth because it is biased in a certain direction. In this case, the bias was towards telling us fewer visits than we actually had. And so how do you avoid collection bias? How do you avoid these kind of fundamental problems that, as you can obviously see, would prevent you from being data-driven by lying to you repeatedly? Well, first, don't collect everything. Your typical intuition is to collect every number you can possibly collect from your app or your website. And the danger in that is once you collect everything, it's very difficult to know what any individual metric is and make sure they're all actually correct. You would rather have fewer metrics that you really understood and knew were correct than a whole mess of metrics that you're kind of not sure about. Because the minute you can't trust them, they're not useful. So I would say you don't want to have hundreds of metrics. You'd be better off with dozens that you really understood. The second is you really want to define the metrics you're collecting. What are they? What defines a visit? What defines a prospect? What defines a lead? You want to make sure you understand those things very well. And everybody involved in your product, from your product managers to your engineers to your marketing managers to your salespeople, they understand exactly what that is. Because if there are interpretation problems, meaning one person thinks a visit is one thing and somebody else thinks a visit is something else, these collection bias problems will come about not because somebody made a mistake, but just because there are misunderstandings between your team. And finally, you want to test your data when you change your product. And it's very typical when you make a change to your product to test functionality, to make sure everything's working. But a lot of companies fail to actually test that the data they're collecting after the changes is still correct. And what will often happen is you make a change and it'll break your data collection. All of a sudden, now you have junk data from one release to the next until you fix that problem. So making testing your data part of your testing process is really important because that's what will prevent this from happening and catching up on you unexpecting. So that was collection bias. Let's talk about interpretation bias, which is of course a second kind of bias that I have time to talk about. So this is the number of active users of a mobile application, data that they were nice enough to let me use. As you can tell, it's from a little while ago, but let's presume it's like today. And our CEO or our head of operations come to us and say, how are we doing? Are we on track? Are things going well? And we're looking at this data, and I'm really not sure. Are things up and to the right? Are they kind of down? Are they flat? It's really hard to tell because the noise is really the data is really noisy. So let's try to add trend lines. So if you're not familiar with the trend line, it's a line that tries to match the trend of the data using mathematics that I won't get into right now. And it tries to tell us a general sense of which direction the data is going. So let's add a simple trend line, and there's the best fit trend line that's a straight line. And what I see here is that if I trust a trend line, it's up and to the right, and that's great, right? So we're up 50%, almost 50% from the end of the year to the beginning of the year, the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and that's great. That's fantastic. But the problem is that actually that line doesn't look like it fits the data at all. I don't know that I believe that that line, straight line, is really there in the data. So let's try a different trend line that is a curve, and that looks like it fits a lot better. I have a good feeling about that. Although it's kind of going up and then right at the end there. I don't know that I trust that that curve is continuing. If I show this to the CEO or the board of the company, they may think that that trend is going to continue, and that's probably pretty unlikely. So let's try again. Let's try a different trend line. That one is better. If you're familiar with mathematics, we're now up to a fourth degree polynomial trend line, and that looks fantastic. It looks a lot better. But is that the best? Is it better than the other two? To be honest with you, there is no right answer. I have no idea because the data in and of itself does not tell us which is the correct pattern, and none of them will tell us how to predict the future effectively. So if I was curious again, will this trend continue into next year, or what might our active users look like? It's a lot up to your judgment as a founder, as an interpreter of data, as an executive making decisions about how to actually use this data and which trend line is the right one. I will tell you that there are many startup pitches that use a line like this, the curve that goes up and to the right. There are other people who sit in their offices looking at curves like this and panicking before their next board meeting. Interpreting your data is hard because it requires you to bring the knowledge of your business to bear to understand which patterns are real and which patterns are not real, and what is the best fit and what is the data telling you. There is no objective answer to what is the best pattern in the data. It ends up being your interpretation of that. Now, there will be patterns which are obvious, right? There will be patterns where everything is either exploding up to the right or plummeting down to the right. Those things are obvious, but you'd be surprised how often it is the case, just like this example we have here, that the answer is really not clear. And anybody who's ever run an A/B test will tell you it's very rare, for example, for an A/B test to give you a crystal clear answer about which option is better. And so you end up in this world of interpreting the data and trying to gather what you can learn. And so how do we avoid interpretation bias, letting us read something in the data that isn't actually there? Reading a trend of growth into data that has no growth, or even worse, reading a normal read into the data where there may actually be a decline or some sort of crash. The first is make sure you form your conclusions from the data, not vice versa. If you come to a conclusion and you go to the data looking to justify it, you will find ways to justify it. Considering how not clear the signal from the data is, you could justify almost any opinion about the data just from looking at it. So you would much rather form conclusions from the data and not vice versa. Secondly, seek out independent analysis. Find somebody who is not a stakeholder, somebody who is not held to that particular metric, and ask them to interpret the data. Because somebody who is not being measured by a specific metric will be much better at understanding what direction that metric is going than somebody who actually has an incentive to read a certain interpretation into the data. And finally, triangulate. If you use multiple different data sources or different metrics to figure out the same thing, it's much harder to read false interpretation because the signal should hopefully be clear. And if anything, the signal maybe there is no signal. It might be there is no trend. Things are just flat. There is no growth. There is no decline. Everything is just flat. And the more you triangulate it, the easier it is for you to come to that conclusion. And hopefully, if you do those things, you will not have your data lied to you. Which brings us to our third section, about selecting tools, also known as don't buy 200 hammers, please, because they're, useless if you have that many. So if you think about the types of business intelligence, in analytics, there's two kinds of analytics. There's descriptive analytics and event-based analytics. Descriptive analytics are tools like Google Analytics or Flurry, where you do a very simple integration into your app or your website, and it gives you a very large breadth of data. And these are standardized metrics like website visits or mobile application sessions, and it gives you a very robust set of metrics about your business with very little effort because those metrics are standardized across everyone who's using it. A second kind is event-based analytics, and these are tools where there is no out-of-the-box solution. You actually will decide what events to report, what things to track, and in doing so, essentially create your own metrics. And it allows that level of customization allows you to track almost anything you want and think about it almost any way you need to. It's just the integration cost is higher because you have to figure out the metrics you want to track and you have to figure out how to track them, and then you have to make sure you know how to make use of them. However, no matter what you might think from the title of this talk, Effective Analytics, or everything I've said so far, business intelligence and analytics is not just about these analytics tools. It's not just about these metrics. Your business intelligence universe includes your sales or CRM system, your customer support system, your financial accounting system, your billing system, your advertising system, your inventory management if you're e-commerce, and this is only a sample of it. In fact, everything that part of your business is part of your business intelligence and contributes to your analytics and data-driven decision making. It would be silly for me to focus only on, for example, what my descriptive analytics service is telling me about user retention without also looking at customer support to see if customer support requests going up correlates with a decline in user retention. Likewise, if I'm trying to track my profitability, it'd be silly for me to use only event-based analytics tracking my purchases if I'm not also looking at my billing system to see how many of those are chargebacks or false accounting, and then go to my financial accounting system to understand how much revenue I can actually recognize. These things are all interrelated, and you need to think about your business from all these different angles. And while you wouldn't primarily use, for example, Stripe for analytics, it's important to realize that it is part of your business intelligence suite. And so with all these tools you can use to answer questions, what do you need is the most important question. It isn't what can you use. You should not integrate things like Mixpanel just because everybody else does. You don't need to use all these tools just because everyone else is. Start from the questions that you need. So what are your KPIs? Remember at the beginning we started from our vision, we went to our goals, then we derived KPIs. So really when you think about effective analytics, only tools you should use are the ones that help you figure out what your KPIs are and answer those metrics questions. You should not use things just because you're used to using them or everybody else does. And it's important also to realize that these tools come with a cost, and sometimes you don't think about it in terms of the cost of analytics. But let me give you an example that you need to make sure you understand. Let's say one of these tools that we're using for our business intelligence or our analytics, it charges a penny per 1,000 events, which is sounds really cheap, right? That's fantastic. That's really cheap. And on average, we see about 10 of these events, whatever these events are. I don't know what system we're using. This is an abstract system. It could be our customer support system or our analytics system or something. On average, a user would generate 10 of these tracking events per session, and there are about 3 sessions per day per user. So a user uses our service 3 times a day. They generate 10 events each of those sessions, and it costs us about a penny per 1,000 events. And so if we have 10,000 users, it's actually really cheap. It's $90 a month, which is fantastic. That's great. And we love this service. It tells us a lot for very little. The problem is if we're successful, and these days, especially in the mobile ecosystem where you can just go from 0 to 60 in a matter of days, if not weeks, if we were to be successful, if things go well, and all of a sudden we have 1.5 million users, now we're paying $13,500 a month, and that's a lot. And that's with the same mathematics. And so a lot of these services, it's important to be careful that you don't end up signing on to a pricing plan where if you are successful, the pricing becomes punitive. And it's not a matter of not using these tools. Often it's just making sure you have an account manager at that company or that service provider where you can talk about pricing and change your pricing plan as you're successful. But I have seen many companies that have gone from 10,000 users to 1.5 million users and woke up one day and had a bill that they did not expect that was very, very large that they could not pay. And so just make sure you're aware of this. And like I said, it doesn't mean don't use these services. Just be aware of what their costs are and stay in touch with the provider. So if you do see these bursts, you can find some pricing that actually works that you can in fact afford to pay. And that's all I have to say about selecting tools. So let's move on to section 4, known as accountability, or as I call it, does that look right? I don't know, does that look right over there? And so let's see if that in fact does look right. And this is where we get to one of my favorite topics, objective key results, also known as OKRs. OKRs, you probably have heard of them. They've been popularized in recent years. They're highly utilized at Google and many startup companies. And what is an objective key results? And what does that have to do with data-driven decision making? And why does Sean keep talking acronyms? Because they're very confusing. All of those are good questions. So an objective key results is a way to think about setting goals for your team, for your company, where you're using data to make sure you know if you've achieved that objective. And this is important because in business, as you probably have seen in your careers, that's not always the case. So for example, let's say we had an objective to increase the number of qualified leads that for our product this month. Well, our key results may be 20% more leads. And so you would know that we had succeeded in achieving that objective if we had 20% more leads next month than we had this month. Another example would be we want to improve the user experience of the product this month. And so our key results would be the users spend 5% more time in the product next month and customer support requests drop 10%. And finally, we want to improve sales this month. And then next month, that means we've raised our per customer revenue by 15%. And the reason this is so important and these key results are so meaningful is imagine, ignore that key results column for a second. You probably have seen people with the objectives of increasing leads or improving the product or improving sales. And in and of themselves, those objectives don't mean anything. The goal of the key results is that you have now found a way to quantify whether or not you've achieved that objective. And it's very important that in an objective key results system that you're using effectively, you are not going to say, if I don't hit 20% more leads next month, I'm an abysmal failure because I failed to reach my objective. In general, you have to realize that if you are not setting objectives and key results that are aggressive, you're probably not pushing as hard as you want. And so if you don't, in fact, let's say we did want to increase the number of leads, and we thought we would be able to prove that if we had 20% more leads, and we don't have 20% more leads next month, the goal is to actually do a retrospective and figure out why. What exactly kept us from achieving that key result of 20% more leads so we can learn from this in the future. And that becomes the power of the OKR system. It's that now, because we can measure each of our objectives quantitatively, we can also retrospectively figure out what kept us from doing that so we can be better in the future, both about setting objectives but also in achieving those objectives. So who should have OKRs? I am of the opinion everyone on your team should have OKRs. Each team should have their own OKRs, and the company needs to have its OKRs. The company's OKRs, by the way, are actually your goals and your KPIs. And so you think about when we talked about goals and KPIs, it's no different than what I'm talking about with OKRs here for your company. Likewise, each individual on your team needs an objective and a key result that they can look to achieve, and that should be tied back to the goals of the company and to the vision of the company. Everyone on your team should understand if they achieve their objective and achieve their key result, it should be able to clearly map to the company's goals and the company achieving its objectives. Because if that's true, then everybody will understand why what they're doing is important, and they'll also have key ownership of it. And that is how you build a data-driven team. When they understand their objectives, they understand how they actually will be measured, the key results, but also how that maps to the company performance, because in the end, if everyone achieves their objectives and those key results are realized, the company should achieve its goals, and the company should achieve the KPI goals that you set for the company. The same thing for a team. Now, a company's goals and KPIs will be very high level, and a team's will be more specific, and individuals' OKRs will be very specific, things that they're actually doing, tasks that they're achieving and work that they're doing. And so it will differ based on the level that you're setting them what they are. But as long as they all tie together, as long as it's obvious about why what I do as a person will help my team achieve its objectives and key results, and as long as it's clear how each team's objective and key results will help the company achieve its goals and its vision, then everybody will understand and it'll fit together very well. I've had this debate with some people over time. I will tell you that my opinion is that while the company should not have more than 5 KPIs or 5 OKRs, depending on what parlance you want to use, an individual is rarely effective if they have more than one. And the reason is that individuals can only ever have a single number one priority because there's just only one thing you can spend most of your time doing. And while people may do more than one things, you will only have, again, one number one priority. A team and a company can have more than one because they have more than one person, assuming you're not a one-person company, in which case that's not true. But assuming you are not a one-person company, while the individuals can't scale up, a company can scale up, and that's how you get to leverages. And it is true that focus is the rarest resource you have at a startup company. And making sure that focus is well utilized is important. It's very hard to sit down and say each person on my team can only have one OKR because the temptation is to give everyone multiple OKRs so you can do more stuff. But I will say that I've always found it to be more effective if people had a single objective and a single key result that they could really work towards, that they could own, that they could make sure they are achieving to the best of their abilities. And that's where focus comes from. The minute everybody in your team has a half dozen OKRs, they're not focused. Which one do they work on first? Or how do you decide if they're successful if half of those OKRs are successful and half of them aren't? It's very difficult to do, but if everybody has a single one, it's very clear what they're doing and where they're driving. At the same time, you should make sure your team contributes to deciding what their OKRs are. It's often very inefficient to tell your company, these are your objectives and these are your key results, go achieve them. That's what they do at big companies, and it's very difficult to have your team really tackle something with passion if that's how you operate. I find it's much more effective to say, these are our company goals, these are our company KPIs. Let's talk about what kind of OKRs we can set up for you to help the company achieve those goals. And once people participate in the creation of their OKRs, you will find they will approach them much more passionately, and in many cases have a much higher success rate of achieving them. So let's move on to our final section. Now that we've talked about metrics, we've talked about tools and measurement, we've talked about objectives and how to use them to motivate your team. How are we actually going to measure success? Which is why I call this section, Are We There Yet? So no matter everything I've said so far about numbers and management and these things, it's important to never lose sight of the fact that your vision is more important than your metrics. And the reason is very simple. Your metrics can only tell you what's already happened, and your vision tells you where you're going. And vice versa is never the case. And so the reason your vision is more important is that it will be very hazy. It's, as I mentioned before, it's very unlikely your metrics are painting a clear picture of where you should go or what you should do. Your vision ends up being your compass. It tells you where to go. Unfortunately, it's not as accurate as a GPS, but it does tell you what direction you want to keep going to get to where you want to be. Your metrics will only tell you how well, again, you're progressing on your path of getting there. And so in a case where your metrics are telling you certain things, in many cases your metrics may tell you very bad things on your way to your vision because your vision is new and revolutionary. If you're creating something brand new or starting from scratch, your metrics may not be good just because you're so revolutionary, you're so new that it can't possibly tell you that the future is materializing the way that you expect. And that becomes a burden of being a leader and being a founder, is having a vision that you believe in enough that you're willing to realize that the metrics may not always justify what you believe is the truth. At the same time, it is possible that your metrics will be so clearly communicating the fact that you're wrong and your vision is flawed that you will adjust your vision, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Your vision probably will evolve over time as you build your company, and if it doesn't, you're one of the very rare visionaries that is just basically part prophet and part founder. And for most of us, our visions evolve as we get farther down the path, and the metrics can inform that, and that's an important part of the process of developing a company. But I just want to emphasize the fact that remember what your vision is. Print it out in big letters and paste it on the wall of your office so everybody looks at your vision every day. Especially if you have a very large dashboard of metrics. Some people have gecko boards on their wall and it makes you look very data driven. But right next to that or right over that should be your vision, because if it's not, and you let your metrics drive your company, and your company becomes all about optimizing your KPIs, you will lose sight of your vision and you will cease moving forward and being innovative. Because again, metrics will tell you what's happened, it won't tell you where you're going, and that's why you have to rely on your vision. So wait, what about growth? Everything Sean's talked about so far exists in the steady state. What about, we're startup companies, we need to grow. That's what we're in the business of doing. How does growth fit into all this, and what does that have to do with success? Well, the reality is, if you're a startup company, especially if you're a venture-backed startup company, your goal is to produce a growth line that looks like this, which is exponential value creation. And if you don't have exponential value creation, not only are you not a good venture-backed investment, you probably are not going to grow fast enough to achieve your vision. It's just very difficult to do. Notice that this has no x and y axis. The x-axis ostensibly would be some sort of time, and the y-axis would be some KPI that you're using to measure success. It's very hard to plan for this, though. In fact, I would argue that you cannot plan for this kind of growth because it's impossible. It happens to you. And if you're very lucky, things go very well, and this is what your growth curve looks like. But it's almost impossible to engineer. So what does that mean? How can we actually plan for growth? How can we measure success? And in fact, if success is growth like this, how in the world does all these metrics we've talked about so far even matter? Well, the good news is while we can't plan for this kind of growth, there are things we can plan for. And one thing is, let's set our first goal. So remember, we're driving our vision into goals and our goals into KPIs. Our first goal could be something simple. And you notice if it's low enough down there on the growth curve, it's almost basically a straight line from 0 to goal 1. And that's something that's achievable. Right? Maybe our goal is 100 enterprise customers or 10,000 users of our mobile app or some metric that we think is achievable as our first goal that's very tractable and we know we can get to. Well, then our next goal after that needs to be 10x larger. So goal 2 is now 1,000 customers for enterprise app or 100,000 users of our mobile application. And then our next goal is 10x larger than that. So our next goal would be 10,000 enterprise users or a million users of our mobile app, and so on and so forth, as we have progressive goals, each of which is 10x larger than the last one. And the reason that this allows you to plan for this hypergrowth is that at each stage, if you imagine you achieve a goal, if you're immediately looking at being 10x larger than you are, it forces you to focus on what you need to change and what you need to do. You cannot get comfortable in your company as it's growing because how you get to 100 customers is very different than how you get to 1,000. It's very different how do you get to 10,000, and which is also different than how you get to 100,000. Or in mobile apps or consumer websites, how you get to 10,000 users is very different than a million, which is very different than 10 million and very different than 100 million. And so always thinking about your next goal as being 10x where you are today puts you in the mindset of creating value fast enough that you can actually create this kind of growth curve. Now, the time may not be a straight line. Your goals may go up and down over time, and it may not look like a perfect curve, but at every point your goal is that next 10x leap, it will force you to reanalyze your business. It will force you to set the right goals. It'll force you to set the right KPIs, and it'll force you to think about your business in a way that will create this value as fast as you can. Which is great. So we're all done. We went through how to use effective analytics for your startup company. To review what we learned, we need to choose 5 KPIs, or preferably less than 5, but at least 5 KPIs, no more than 5 KPIs. You want to actually make sure the metrics that you're tracking are accurate so they don't lie to you by avoiding bias. Use only the tools you need. Don't use tools just because everyone else is using them. Make sure you implement OKRs for everyone. That's how you close the loop and make sure that the metrics and KPIs you've set up are used and effective in running your business. And finally, your vision is the most important thing. No numbers will ever replace your internal compass for where you're going. And make sure you realize that and drive forward. I wish you good luck. This is my contact information. If you're curious on how to get a hold of me or you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I hope you found this talk to be very useful.